I'm going to show you how we can use an Excel spreadsheet to analyse the height data that we've looked at in the lecture example. This is what the finished version will look like in Excel 2007, but I'm going to close this for now and show you how we can recreate it from scratch. First of all, we need to start an empty Excel workbook. Here I'm using Windows 7. The details will differ slightly depending which version of Windows you're using, but if we click on the Start button at the bottom left corner of the screen and select All Programs, then here I want Microsoft Office, and then within that I will find Microsoft Office Excel 2007, which is the version of Excel that I'm using in this demonstration. We start with an empty spreadsheet, but before we continue it's worth checking whether we've got the data analysis tool enabled, because we're going to be using that several times in this example. So if we click on the Data tab at the top of the screen and then look to see if there's a data analysis icon, it would appear somewhere at the right hand side, but it's not there, which means we need to install it. To do that, we click on the Office button at the top left of the screen and then select Excel Options from the bottom of that menu. Then from the left hand side of the Excel's Options menu we click on Add-ins. Then from the available add-ins we select Excel Add-ins and click Go. These are the available Excel add-ins. Analysis Tool Pack is the one we want. It hasn't got a tick against it. If I click that box I get a tick against it, and that means I can now install it if I click on OK. If this is the first time that this has been installed, you'll get a message saying, would you like to install this? Say yes, and it'll take a few moments to install, but then it should become available. When it is installed, you'll now find that on the Data tab you have this icon for Data Analysis available, and that's what we want. So to continue from there with an empty spreadsheet, we click on the first cell here, A1, the top left cell, which is now highlighted. And we're going to type in there patient, because that is what we're going to put in that column. Put in the word patient and press return. Then we're going to have the patient numbers below that. The first patient is number 1, and I type 1 and press enter, and it enters that and moves down to the next cell. The next is 2, I press enter and it moves down to the next cell as well. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and we've got 10 patients. So that's given us the patient number in column A. Now I click on cell B1 and that becomes the active one, and I'm going to put the heights in this column, so I type the word height and press return. That moves down to cell B2 and I put in the height of patient 1, which is 180, and press return, and the height of the next patient is 154, and I press return. 155, return. 158, 169, 177, 165, 182, 192, and 168. That's the height of patient 10. So there we've got the patients and their heights. Now we want to add all those up. So in this cell A12 here, I'll type the word total and press return. I'm going to put the total in this cell here, but to do that I can use a quick method to add up all the heights. So if I click on the cell of the first height, which is B2, and keeping the mouse button held down, I drag down over all the heights and continue into the empty cell where I want the total to go. So I've highlighted all the numbers plus the empty cell. I can now release the mouse button. Now I want to use the auto sum feature, which comes under the Formulas tab. So I click on Formulas and we should find there the auto sum, which is this icon here. When I click auto sum, it automatically adds up all the numbers and puts the sum into the blank cell at the bottom. 1700 is the sum of all those heights. In order to calculate the average, we have to divide that total by the number. Now we know there are 10 there, but we can show how Excel can actually do that for us. If I type in into the cell A13 number, because that's going to be the number of patients, and then I put in here the formula to add them all up, which is going to be a formula. So I start by typing the equals sign, which means I'm entering a formula, and then I type in the function that I want, which is count, C-O-U-N-T, and open brackets, and then tell it what I want to count. So I put the mouse over the first number, the first height, hold the left mouse button down and drag down over the others and stop after the last one, and it automatically enters the range B2 to B11 for me, and then I put a close bracket and press return, and it does the adding up. It counts all those cells. There are 10 cells there. Now, of course, you will remember that the average or the mean, so I type in mean into that cell there, is going to be the total divided by the number. So this cell here is going to contain the mean or the average, and the formula for that is the total divided by the number. So if I type the equals key to say that I'm about to enter a formula, and then point to the cell I want to calculate, which is B12, and then a slash to mean divide, and point with the mouse to the one I want to divide by, which is B13, B12 divided by B13, press return, and I get the answer 170. So the answer there is 170. That is the average or mean value of those heights. We can do that in another way. Let me put in this cell below another way of calculating the average. Excel has a function called average, so if I put there equals, meaning I'm typing a function, and then the word average, which is the name of the function, open bracket, and once again tell it what I want to average. So I click on the first height down to the last height, B2 to B11, release the mouse button, close bracket, return, and it's calculated the average using the average function for me. I can also calculate the standard deviation in a similar way. If I type SD into cell A16 there as a label, and then click on B16, I'm going to enter the standard deviation there, and the function for that equals, to say I'm entering a formula, and the function is STDEVP, and then open brackets, and once again drag down over the cells I want to calculate, close bracket, and return, and the standard deviation is 11.96662. That's a little bit more precise than we want, so let me format that so it looks a bit neater with not so many decimal places. I click on that cell to say that's the one I want to format, and then on the Home tab at the top of the screen here, I'm looking for formatting numbers, and in this group here I've got number format, and if I click there, then I get this format cells, and I can now click on the number tab here and the number category, and it's by default got 2 decimal places. I think 1 will be enough for us. If we reduce that to 1 and say OK, it changes this number to 1 decimal place. Right, there we've seen how we can calculate the mean and the standard deviation by typing in formulae. Actually, Excel has got an even easier way to do it using the data analysis tools. We've already seen that we've installed that before we started. If we go to data, we've now got the data analysis tool available here. So if we click the data analysis icon, the tool that we want here is descriptive statistics. There, select descriptive statistics in the list and say OK. This wants to know what data it's got to describe, so input range, click on the box there for input range, and then point to the input range by dragging down over the data, including the word height at the top of the column down to the last height, 168. So the data is in a column, but the first row contains the word height. So if I click this labels in first row, that tells me that the first row here contains the word height. That's not part of the data, it's just a label. The output range is going to go somewhere, so we click that button to say I want to enter the output range, click in this cell to say where the output range will be, and then I'll point to the cell E1 as a suitable place to put the output range. And we have to say what statistics we want. Let's just select summary statistics, that'll be enough for this. When we click OK, Excel calculates summary statistics and puts it in cell E1. We can't quite read all of that. If you select the dividing line between columns E and F and drag to the right, you can make that column wide enough to read everything without any difficulty. And you see there we've got a mean of 170, which agrees with what we calculated, a standard error of 3.98. We'll talk more about that in a later lecture. The median value of 168.5. Remember, the median value is the one that's got half above and half below. The mode would be the most frequently occurring. There isn't a mode here because no one value occurs more than once, so there is no mode. The standard deviation is 12.6. Well, actually that's slightly different to the 12.0 that we've calculated here. That's because it uses a slightly different formula. It uses stdev rather than stdevp. We'll talk about the difference between those in a later lecture. The variance is the square of the deviation. The kurtosis and the skewness relate to how asymmetric they are. The range of 38 is the difference between the minimum and the maximum of these values. The sum we've already seen is 1,700 and the count is 10. So this descriptive statistics tool is a quick way of getting all those numbers without having to do them manually, but you can do it by this way if you prefer. Okay, we're going to graph this data, and to do that I need to create a histogram. So first of all I need to define the upper and lower limits of each bin. So if I choose a cell somewhere down here at B21 and put in the upper limit of the bin, the height bins. Let's make a bin at 154 and I press return, and another one at 164 and at 174 and at 184 and 194. Those will be the upper limits of my height bins. And now to create the histogram I need to again use the data analysis tool. So on the data tab here I select data analysis, and there's an option there for histogram. If I select histogram and say OK, it needs to know where the input data is. The input data, as always, is the data in the columns here. And we're going to select just B2 to B11 this time. I've not included the label at the top in height, so I don't check this button which says I've included the labels. The needs to know where the bin range is, so click on the cell for the bin range, and the bin range are these numbers that I've just entered here, 154 to 194. And the output range, click on that button and then click in the cell for output range, and we'll put the output range somewhere at C20, just here, just above my bins. So when we say OK, it puts here the frequency of each bin. So a frequency of 1 for bin 154, 2 in 164, 3 in 174, 3 in 184 and 1 in 194. So that's the frequency calculated for us. Now we need to graph that. In order to do that, we first select the data we want to graph, which is the cells D21 to D25. Once we've selected that by dragging over it, then we can create the graph. To do that, I want the Insert tab. So the Insert tab from the top of the screen, and where we're looking for is inserting a chart. We're going to look in the chart group here. There are several sorts of chart. The one we want is a column chart. So click on columns, and then 2D columns will do as fine. So the first of the 2D columns gives us automatically the graph of this data organized into columns. If we want, we can drag it further across the screen to somewhere more suitable. And now we can just titivate it up a bit. So if we have the chart selected by clicking on it as we do now, and then we go to the Design tab at the top of the screen here, we can select the Select Data icon here. select data has already got the chart data range in because we selected that before we started, but we want to put in some data for the horizontal category axis labels. So if we click on edit here, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the moment. We can be a bit more clever than that. If we click on edit, it wants to tell us where the labels are. So this axis label range is actually these bin labels there. And when we say OK to that, it's put those numbers in here instead of the 1, 2, 3, 4 that we had. And now the graph is labelled with proper heights there. So we can say OK to that, but now in the Layout tab we can improve things a bit here. So select Layout and then Axis Titles. So Axis Titles, if we choose the horizontal axis first of all, primary horizontal axis below, title below the axis, and the axis title here is going to be height. So instead of axis title there, we can put in the word height. And if we want to do the same for the vertical axis, again from the Layout tab, Axis Titles, and the primary vertical axis, we'll have a rotated title on the vertical axis, and it's going to say frequency. So if we get rid of what is there and put in the word frequency instead, that's the label that we want for the axes. So we've pretty well got everything finalized there. All we need to do is to save the result. So if we click on the Office button at the top left and do Save As, it'll ask us for a file name to save it as, and if we just call it something like heights and save, then we have our result saved. So there we have recreated the whole spreadsheet in Excel. You can see that there's several ways of doing things, but the data analysis tool is a very handy way of describing the data or of plotting it, and in later lectures we'll see other things we can do with that same tool. So getting familiar with Excel is quite useful.